Hajj, America will be different. I remember my uncle said to me, smiling, when I cracked the piece of news about my trip to America. I was clustered around him as I had always done growing up, tapping his wisdom. We sat on his porch as the day thinned into evening. My trip to America was groundbreaking and rebellious. My ancestors were survivors of tribal wars who fled from Mozambique into Malawi in the 19th century. They first settled on the coast of Lake Malawi and traded in ivory and grains. Shortly, the monsoon wind on the Indian Ocean propelled the Arabs in their ships to the coast of Africa. They came to poach humans to labor for booming plantations economy in the Arab world. My ancestors got the guns from these Arabs and became their middlemen in the Indian Ocean slave trade. When the British abolished the Indian Ocean slave trade, my ancestors came and settled in this small town with rich, dark, fertile soil where they grew corn and domesticated animals, a town I was born in later on. Peasantry was enough for them. That they could jump the Atlantic Ocean to chop their pound of American dream they never dreamed of, never heard of perhaps. Think of America as a tree, my uncle's lecture continued, interfering the buzz of an azan calling out the town for the evening salat at the mosque. A tree with fruits on it. Up there you get to see both ripe and unripe fruits. He stopped and swallowed down saliva noisily. I could hear the saliva fighting its way down his throat. I take you to be smart enough to understand things in a few ways. Mingle with the community. Don't be afraid mixing with your next door neighbors and anyone on the street. All this advice, yet my uncle was not a widely traveled man. The furthest he had gone in his life was to the north of our tiny country. But the man was my mentor. As a kid, he furnished me with pencils, pens, notebooks, or children's books from his workplace. He was a sweeper in the Department of English at a nearby law college. My uncle's prophecy came to pass. This small town of Auburn in Alabama was different. Instead of feeling like I climbed it betrayed me. The first days were challenging. Coming to America as groundbreaking as it had seemed to my people. Yet after my first days in America, I wanted to return home as soon as I had arrived. First, when I moved into the Warwick apartments on West Green Avenue, none of my neighbors came to greet me or gossip about the town. Back in my hometown of Chirunga, when a neighbor moved in, you first help them unload their belongings, gossip about their new place, and bring them food on their first night. Not in Auburn. Even not at an Airbnb in Tuskegee where I stayed waiting for my lease to kick in at Warwick apartment. I had expected the owner of that dinky and ghosted Airbnb to show up, greet me, take me around the yard. I needed an orientation considering the creepiness of Tuskegee. Most buildings were neglected, windows shattered, walls mutilated with murals and graffiti. Inside those skeleton buildings, bushes were flourishing their way to the roofs. At the center of the town, there was a human figure wrapped in tarpaulin. It could be a real human or a mere scarecrow, who knew? But no, those online transactions and emails were enough for my orientation of the Airbnb. Anyway, that's what they called the American efficiency. Even the occupants in the other rooms of this tiny house, I couldn't tell what they looked like, except their deep Southern American accent, as if they had been plugged lugs in their mouths, which broke the flow of air every time they articulated a word. With this American efficiency, one might end up in the same house with a serial killer. It was very ironic how America, as a country, was hungry for globalization on the international level. Yet at home, Americans were individually isolated from each other. so isolated, as I later learned they called cops on their own neighbors. In my village, tenants lived like a family. People were familiar with each other. Kids roamed freely around the town. They could go to the end of the town to play football until sundown. It did not bother their parents. Your next door's neighbor's children were your own, but not the kids in Auburn. Maybe or maybe not in America as a whole. They did not come out after school to play or loiter around by themselves. They were hiding somewhere in the hives of their homes, or else one could see the kids on the sidewalk but rushed on to their parents' arms. Which country did you say you're from again? Jeff asked me. He was my neighbor at Warwick Apartments, a neighbor I had labored to get to sit down and talk with. Now I was climbing. We sat in front of his studio apartment. He puffed in and sent a cloud of smoke into the sky from a Marlboro cigarette he stuck between the middle and the index fingers. Today he wasn't wearing his pants and the steel toe boots I had seen him in days before. The pants and the boots were always covered in red dirt as if they had been abandoned to a vacant sand quarry for a decade. His skin was freckled, most likely by the hot and humid weather of Alabama. Alabama was south enough. Before my departure, my people had advised me to get warm clothing. It is called in America this, it's known in America that. To them, America was the capital of the cold. That there were places like Alabama they didn't know. That you could feel like you were in a ship being steamed, they had no idea. I'm from Malawi, I said. Did you say Mali? He drew in closer to catch the name. Malawi, I said. M-A-L-W-I. Never heard about it before. I felt my identity wiped out of existence. He hit the tip of the cigarette with his finger and the end that glowed, and the moon of ash scattered on the ground before being drifted away by the bloom of wind. Gonna have to look it up on Google Map. He retrieved his phone, swiped onto Google Map to excavate me back to existence. It's like a thin, long potato on the southern map of Africa, landlocked, and everyone with access to the water tosses us around all the time. Do you plan on going back to your country or will you stay in the United States? Americans I had met were very strange. These questions followed soon after greetings. In my culture, a man who asked a stranger such question rarely saw visitors at his doorstep. Asking a visitor whether they would stay under your roof temporarily or forever was interpreted as telling them to wrap up and leave. Yes, I'm going back after my program, he said. I wouldn't be here, I thought to myself, if I did not assure that visa officer that I would return to my home country after my studies, that I would use the knowledge and skills that America bestowed on me to better my own home country. You want to go back to Africa? He seemed very startled by my response. Yes, that's my home. You don't want to stay in America? Temporarily, I felt like I had offended him. I thought he took my answer for not liking America. Then he said, I watched a video of an American YouTuber who filmed a small village in Africa in which kids walked long distance to get clean water. He was calling for Americans to donate money. Which part of Africa was that? I asked him. I'm not sure, but it was a small village in Africa. That was the thing, I thought to myself. Africa was big and diverse. But regardless of that, America had a single image for all Africans. If you were born in Africa, you would be a victim of poverty. I asked him, switching the topic. So, born and raised in Alabama? I'm from the Midwest, Indiana. He stabbed the cigarette butt in a transparent jar that sat by the window and killed the thin curl of smoke. The jar was almost full of cigarette a beach house town called Frankfurt. I was homeless down there in Georgia by West Point at a campsite. I slept in my car. He pointed at his gray van nosed between an old GMC Sierra truck and a Chevy SUV in the parking lot. I looked at him searchingly as if to crack something open on him. In my hometown, where a string of hovels clustered on both edges of the main road, cars were considered a luxury. America is different. You can be poor, yet you own a car. A car is a need. Jeff clarified after noticing the way I glanced at him upon mentioning that he slept in his car. In my country, I continued thinking, we had shanty towns that looked like landfills with their corrugated rusty roofing. Yet at sundown after a busy day, these streets were empty. Almost everyone had a home to return to because one could easily dig clay or wetted earth, bake it into bricks and dry them and erect a house. I had seen Americans on the street of Chicago and Columbus, Ohio. Their streets were clamped with makeshift stands, men and women, homeless, wearing several layers of clothing. They were like meat wrapped in tortillas of clothing ready for sharp bites from the unfriendly cold of the streets. Some of them panhandling, and one of the signs read, "Help a veteran, $100 short of security deposit for apartment to get off the streets. God bless." I was a kid when I watched on TV America tear down Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Then in school, I read Greatest American Victories, the D-Day, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so on. And well-manned America's military bases in all corners of the globe, whose watchtowers roamed over the earth like a pit bull policing and sniffing any threat to her booming civilization. Yet upon returning home, America pushed her veterans onto the street and reduced their lives almost to the same rubble they left in the enemy countries. And the needles were supplied to them to nail them further to the street. Jeff and other homeless people I saw on the street made me realize the word poverty was so diverse. The World Bank, the United Nations, classified the poor in my country as those that lived on less than $1 a day. But in America, I saw and met people who jingled things worth more than $1, yet they were classified as poor. As Jeff and I chatted away into the night, my uncle's advice resounded in my head. Think of America as a tree, explore, and here I was ready to explore in the tree. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Prof. Next up, we have Kyla Walker, who will introduce Adalyne.
Hi, everyone. Okay. Adalyne Perryman graduated from SUNY Oneonta. She has helped with organizing the Adirondack Family Book Festival, bringing together a diverse list of award-winning authors to upstate New York. In her spare time, she casually analyzes the connections between truth and memory, while internalizing all the beauty that the world can offer. She loves a good train ride, magnificent trees, and a nice lake. And you may have seen her around carrying a camcorder, documenting the world through her specific and brilliant lens. Her fiction has been such a pleasure to encounter this semester, and I can assure you that Adalyne Perryman is a name to remember. Now, a few fun facts. Her favorite author is Toni Morrison. She believes in true love, and she just happens to be 1,200 years old. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce to you the admirable and inimitable Adalyne Perryman.
What a month. So thank you, Kyla, for the introduction. The first piece I'm going to read isn't technically fiction by some definitions. It's called Monsoon Season. I'm going to read it once, then I'm never going to read it ever again. And I wrote it in a mysterious location. So let's go. Okay. When I went to Paris, it rained every night. I was lucky in that way. Before I went, everyone warned me about the elusive Paris syndrome, but no one told me that it mostly affects Japanese tourists. I've always wanted to go to Japan. When I was in Paris, I kept watching myself thinking I'd rather be there. According to Wikipedia, the Japanese romanticize Paris so much that when their dream finally comes true, when they meet paid well enough to be rude hospitality staff, and the pigeons pickpocket their phones, they begin having panic attacks, paranoia, and hallucinations in that order. Paris claims there is a hotline for Japanese tourists suffering syndrome, but Japan claims that hotline does not exist. In Paris, I sometimes felt like I was being followed. I can speak a little Japanese. I think speaking a stranger's language is transferring a life. Paris is more beautiful when it rains. French tourism pays for the rain explicitly. The crows don't caw, they cigarette cough. The neighborhood I stayed in, I witnessed a slow murder, gentrification. I was never sure if the people in Paris were passionate or depressed. I was never sure if I was walking left or right. I was so homesick. I'm not sure if I'm depressed or passionate. Why romanticize Paris? French is not a common language in Japan. Japanese is not a common language in France. On my way to the Eiffel Tower, there was a building called Maison de la Culture du Japon. I looked it up. The website is only translated in French or Japanese. They had a kintsugi exhibit, mending cracks with gold. The Japanese manga artist Kaiji Nakazawa only survived the atomic bomb because he was standing beside a wall. The woman he had talked to just before burned. He was 5. In Paris, before, Hitler did a tour of victory and visited the same places I did. Wasn't Paris beautiful? He asked. French art students drew sketches of peers in the internment camps. The sketches are faceless. Paris and Japan were on different sides. What's the difference between an atomic bomb and a genocide? Efficiency. The Eiffel Tower and the Tokyo Sky Tower. Why romanticize Paris? On Duolingo, I practice a frequent question. Doko ni sunde imasu ka? The most important question in the world, of course, where do you live? As stated before, I was homesick. I get homesick very easily. I have many different homes. I thought everyone was going to know I was American right away, and they did when I spoke, but many times I was asked for directions in French. If I was quiet, no one knew the difference. I know more Japanese than I know French. By the time I arrived in Paris, I had 3 different languages in my head. I'm not very good at any of them. After, women who slept with German soldiers were dragged into the streets and had their heads shaved. Returning kamikaze pilots represented the defeat of Japan, and so they were ostracized. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. After Pearl Harbor, instead of the 3 million planes FDR promised, we made 10 million. In God we trust. Without the Second World War, America might still be in the Great Depression. Many people have killed themselves jumping in the Seine. The Seine does not rot, but it saves its smells. Japan's suicide forest is called Aokigahara, or Sea of Trees. I had great passion in Paris. I didn't like the color of the sky. I didn't like the fast bikes. I liked the taste of the water. If you ask me why I started to learn Japanese, I have no answer. I just know I'm homesick. When I was a kid, I always felt like I was being followed. Paris syndrome mostly appears in people who are already mentally ill. Tourism is a war. In Paris, I was a soldier. I didn't relax. I moved through it. I watched a young boy aim his pointer and his thumb over the glass of the Louvre. Where did he learn that from? I assumed he was American. The tower of a gun is a well-known shape. Violence is a universal language. I was mistaught it. I can only talk to myself. I learned too much. I could not relax in Paris. When they dropped that bomb, a little child was saved only because he happened to be picking up a toy behind a wall. That was the only reason. In God we trust. It's so beautiful. 3 languages. Doko ni sunde imasu ka? Maison. Drop the bomb, cadet. Drop it. Please call this number if the results exceed expectations. Look up. In Tokyo, it only rained at night. I was lucky in that way. Where do you live? You have to tell me where you live. I live here. I live here. I have a 395-day streak on Duolingo, so hold your applause. The next piece I'm going to read is an excerpt from a longer work. that I will read again. For a bit of context, I did write this mostly because I'm homesick. There are two characters that sort of mentioned, Scott and John. They're best friends. Scott works at a lumber yard, doing something with lumber. And last night, the night before this section takes place, Scott kissed his long-term crush, Fern, on the forehead. Oh my God. It's really crazy. Okay. Okay. When Scott first met Fern, he thought about dandelions bursting through concrete. They are everywhere in the park. Fern is not everywhere. The park knew about Fern and Bee's arrival before the people did. There had been something in the air. It was sharper, Scott's convinced. The wind blew without direction. The sun was fogged. The night the siblings skidded into the empty trailer, Scott's heart had been racing all day, like it was on the road. They woke up half the park with their scattering engine and bright headlights, but they didn't wake up Scott. No, they did wake up Scott, but mostly Scott is a heavy sleeper. It takes a lot to get him moving. Everyone knew by morning, two kids, young adults, one pregnant, the other skulking around like a storm cloud. Scott's memories of their first day in the park passed by like smoke. He'd only caught glimpses of them on his way to work, one a forever memory of Fern sitting on his stoop, hiding away from the heat and swatting away the bugs. Scott slept on that image. The next morning, his dream slammed on his door and asked, "Are you the one who fixes engines?" Scott was knocked over. He had never heard an accent like that, mud-thick and deep American, drawling on like rain, and there the dandelions fluttered by Fern's feet make a wish. Scott was stuck. Fern crossed his arms, an action Scott would realize later is distinctly his sister, Bee. "Do you have something to say?" "Sure," Scott swallowed, brushing hair away from his forehead. "That's me. John's better with engines than Scott will ever be. Something that runs in their veins, Scott supposes. John is more oil, Scott more wood. Still, Scott didn't do such a bad job. The old Honda engine the siblings drive isn't that complicated. Bee made him lemonade, which was mostly powder, but Scott drank it all. His mouth was numb. Fern had kept his back to Scott as he led him to their trailer, fine enough with Scott, because Fern likes to wear loose shirts. Scott liked the way Fern's hair fluttered on the back of his neck, the mole on his shoulder, dandelions in the pavement. Fern disappeared into the trailer until Scott was done working, then appeared again to give Scott a popsicle, grape, Scott's new favorite flavor. Fern sat on his stoop. His popsicle was bright orange. Scott remembers he bit into it without hesitating. Scott forced himself not to fidget. "You drive that red truck?" Fern asked, each word longer than it should be, taking its time. "Yeah, that truck is mostly parts." "Mostly," Scott breathed through his nose. "It's more money to maintain than it was to buy." Fern said nothing, made a low noise, chewed on his popsicle until it was nothing but stick, then kept chewing. Scott's own popsicle was melting in his hand. "Do you like it here?" Scott blinked. "Where?" Fern narrowed his eyes at Scott, popsicle stick still in his mouth. Scott tugged on his collar. Fixing the engine had made him sweat. Fern raised an eyebrow and made a large motion with both of his hands. "Oh well." Scott looked around. "It's home, I guess." "I know a thing or two about home," Fern said around the stick before letting his hands fall away with it. "I used to, anyway, not long ago, anyway." Fern looked away, glaring down at his knees before popping his head back up to the sky. Then he threw the popsicle stick against the wall of Janine's trailer beside them, and they watched it fall into the shrub. Fern curled into himself, wrapping his arm around his knees, scowling at the gravel, looking for all the world like he might blow away. Scott didn't know what to do with his tongue. "Where are you from?" "Kentucky," Fern mumbled. "I've never been." Fern sighed. "I wouldn't bother." Fern stood up and brushed off his shorts, looking down at Scott from his doorway. Scott's as tall as an oak tree. Even with Fern at the advantage, they were still near the same height. If Fern jumped high in the air, Scott thought suddenly, he could catch him easy. "How much do we owe you?" "For the engine and everything." Scott rubbed the back of his neck. Nothing. We're neighbors after all, right?" Fern cracked his first real smile, a seed shattering a parking lot to make a meadow kind of smile. It was crooked and far from lighting up his whole face, but it was enough for Scott that he would see Fern smile again, that he would hear him laugh, and that the words were true for a moment, maybe, that Fern is his neighbor, and neighbors smile and talk and do favors and check up on each other and think about each other and make each other happy. Thanks, Fern said, I owe you. Then Fern went back into his trailer, closing the door behind him. Scott fished the popsicle stick out from the hole under Janine's stoop and brought it back to his bedroom to be recycled on his nightstand. Scott is a really good neighbor. The day after, Scott took his first and last trip to the public library and checked out a book on the state of Kentucky. He learned all about Kentucky's speed in one night, then never returned it. In the 2.5 years, 24 days, 7 hours, and 45 minutes he's known Fern, walked with Fern, been close to Fern, smiled with Fern. He's never told Fern this. Fern might know less about Kentucky than Scott does. Scott can hear Fern's accent slipping away from him, and he knows this loss will bring Fern closer to his home state. No one knows better than Scott, the tree killer, how hard it is to tear out roots. What if Fern does decide to go back to Kentucky? Fern entered like lightning striking a tree. He can leave as soon as the rain hits, and Scott, the heavy sleeper, will see nothing but smoke when he wakes. When the tree had been stormed into fire 2 nights ago, Scott had run and run to Fern. It was pitch dark out. For a moment, a blinding light, then hot shadow, yes, but that light did nothing for Scott. He was blind. All he wanted to see was Fern, and if Fern left, there would be nothing but the burnt stump of Scott, an empty trailer, and one old popsicle stick. The popsicle stick doesn't even have a joke on it. Nothing holds a life like an all-American boy, a life that has existed or that could exist. Scott has all these images stuck in his head. Fern's beat-up sneakers and Scott's workman boots sitting together, their shoelaces intertwined. Dandelions in the pavement, Fern's eyes like stars when the street light turned back on, and their breath, the same breath, looking up through nighttime eyelashes, Fern's ears going bright pink. As Scott stepped away and the distance between them became a tunnel, Fern silhouetted completely by light, while Scott lost in the dark, unsure if he's going forward or backward. In the tunnel, Scott hears Fern humming My Old Kentucky Home. He's only heard that song through Fern's lips, as Fern's foot swayed in the air, eating popsicles on the stoop, a tradition that started that day, that first day, and cemented by Fern's loyalty. Fern's loyalty is the scariest thing. Fern can never let Kentucky go. Scott gave a piece of himself to Fern last night when he kissed his forehead, and he knows Fern will treasure that piece forever, and Scott will feel himself in Kentucky, or maybe Japan, or outer space, or just down the street, or wherever Fern wants to go. Because Fern can go anywhere, but he can't be everywhere, and every place fills Fern up, but he has to choose one. Scott isn't sure if he will choose this place that smells like trash and shit, that is infested with soldiers and snot, this place in the valley, this place beside Scott. In Fern's eyes, even last night in the dark, so close he could feel the tiny hairs all over Fern's face, Scott could see in Fern's eyes rolling hills and thundering horses. Yes, even last night, with not even air between them, there was still my old Kentucky home far away. Okay.
Thank you, Adalyne. And our final, for our final featured reader tonight, we have Sachi Weber, who will introduce Vince.
Hello. Vince Vasudevan is a multiracial speculative fiction writer interested in the intersection between literary and genre stories. Vince earned his BA in history at Virginia Tech and double minored in physics and national security/foreign affairs. Cool. And he is currently a first reader for James Gunn's Ad Astra. Vince taught his past summer at the Novel Architects Workshop. His long-term goal is to be a university-level educator. Vince writes futures so he can believe in a tomorrow. Give it up for Vince.
Hello, everyone. What's up, man? I'm going to be reading an excerpt from a book that's being in beta reads right now that I finished right before starting the MFA program at Notre Dame, and it is called The Angel Gambit. So I'm going to give a brief 30,000-foot view of the book and then segue into an excerpt from it. A decade-long civil war has fractured our solar system. Planets and moons past the inner asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter have seceded from the empire of Earth's naval defense. forming the Outer World Legion, and an owl. High attrition has forced both sides to conscript ever younger troopers. 16-year-old best friends Hiro Akama and Miles Sharp are assigned to the Hellhounds, N's disposable Special Forces squad. Hiro, still reeling from his mother's death, hates crumpling the bodies of other child soldiers. Miles, crass and prone to hero worship, wants to leverage the Hellhounds for promotions and glory. But during their first mission on Phobos, Hiro barely escapes death to transform into an angel, an extinct alien species that almost annihilated humanity 21 years ago. N's Grand Admiral, seeing Hiro as the key to consolidating his power, pits the two friends against each other. Their only hope of survival lies with the Hellhounds commander, who will lead them on a radical mission, overthrowing their own empire. And to segue into the excerpt, the following speech is by the Grand Admiral near the beginning of the book, delivered at a banquet commemorating what happened on Phobos. For the sake of media literacy, and perhaps in light of recent events, I should say that this is a bad guy, and not me. Thank you for the honorable burden of leadership, proof that I am one of you. To all my fellow Enders, wherever you may find yourself tonight, I have but 3 hallowed words to say. We are victorious. We vanquished the owl forces plaguing our Martian theater through the use of terrifying weaponry and even more terrifying hellhounds. And this was to preserve the sanctity of our solar system. I myself fought and bled alongside you 21 years ago during the halicide against the angels. I myself suffered sleepless nights, tracking our spies as they risked their lives collecting intelligence about Owl's lunar compounds. I myself loaded flux rifles into cargo ships like the tireless logistics workers in our dry docks, and I myself refined Heinleinium like the ingenious builders who build our power armor. I myself wept like Jesus did, with the mothers and the fathers who buried their children, valiant troopers who preferred death than surrendering to those wicked owlies. And I myself heard the 2 young hellhounds defending us against our greatest and most vile enemies. We sacrificed ourselves to damn those owly secessionists. And this represents our enemy. Take a good look. Won't be here for long. Does Jupiter know what it's like to see a squad mate's arms ripped off so that he cannot hold his wife and his child? Does Saturn hear our children crying to save us, only to die in vain? Does Neptune feel our hearts beating to the rhythm of the war drum? They don't. Take pride in our sacrifices. Wear them like invisible medallions lining our chests, but true Enders see them as brightly and as clearly as stars. Owl does not represent order, but disorder. Disorder is rebellion, and disorder must die. During Operation Monolith, back on Phobos, 2 troopers entered into hellfire and forged themselves anew as heroes. One of them followed in my historic footsteps, killing one of the diabolical angels that brought humanity to the brink. These 2 troopers, they hammered the final nail into Owl's coffin of a campaign. These boys, pardon me, these men are our salvation. Mothers and fathers, raise your sons and daughters in their image. Starman Hiro Akama and Starman Miles Sharp, post. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Vince, Proph, and Adalyne. And let's get thank you all for coming out tonight. There's still plenty of food and refreshments, so please enjoy and have fun and chat and mingle. Thanks for coming out.